Thanks, Mike. I don't know how many of the people didn't attend who are here today, didn't attend the 2015. The proceedings of it are, I think, on the Campbell County website. Some great information in there. And hats off to the people that really helped us after that symposium to pull that information together. The next panels is interesting, and we had quite a bit of talk about this at the very beginning. I thought it was kind of obvious, the why of monitoring. But like many things that I think are obvious, when I think about it, it's not as obvious. And I think this panel is really going to be helpful. And it's far more nuanced than I thought. The next panel is the why of monitoring. It's going to be moderated by Gwen McKee. Gwen is the president and principal scientist for Great Plains Wildlife Consulting and is currently based in Sheridan, Wyoming. She's worked in the Powder River Basin and surrounding areas since 1994. Gwen earned MS and BS degrees in wildlife management and ecology from the University of Missouri-Columbia. She has over 28 years of experience as a professional biologist, has worked in several states, spanning the Midwest, Great Plains, and Alaska. Gwen serves as the primary contact for energy industry and regulators in the region regarding potential requirements, design, impact assessment, and mitigation strategies. Her work has encompassed a wide range of activities, not limited to project management, mitigation planning, and implementation. Gwen also occasionally serves as a peer review referee and co-author for professional journals and as an invited speaker at professional meetings. And I want to say Gwen was one of the ones that was immensely helpful afterwards, did an incredible amount of work after 2015 preparing some of the data sheets. So let's welcome Gwen McKee, please.
We have other panelists, I recall.
Sounds good.
Tim. That would be super for me.
Do they have a video? I can't.
Trish, I'll just. I'll walk around.
Here's another mic you guys can use.
Chris. That's a pretty obvious move, I think. Okay, so thank you very much to Governor Friedenthal again for kicking off this with a great introduction for some of the things that we're going to talk about, certainly, and I've taken a few breaths now, so I think I can get through this a little more calmly. I'm just going to introduce our panelists real quick. Andrea Orobana is a non-game bird biologist with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department in Lander. She's the statewide non-game bird biologist, and With over 250 species of breeding non-game birds in Wyoming, she focuses mainly on sensitive species and conducts numerous surveys annually. She is also the president of the Central Mountains and Plains section of the Wildlife Society, an active participant in Partners in Flight, and co-authors or authors various technical planning and resource documents for the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. Kyle Wentland is the Division Administrator for Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality, Land Quality Division. He's been with the department since April of 2015. Prior to that, he was an environmental engineer for the coal manager, and he's held a wide range of environmental and engineering positions over the years and has extensive experience in environmental issues. Mr. Wentland began his career with the Montana Department of State Lands in 1991 with the Coal Regulatory Program and subsequently moved to private industry in 1993. He holds a Master's of Science and Bachelor's of Science in Range Management with a focus in disturbed land reclamation from the University of Wyoming Laramie, and he has been nationally recognized for his contributions in advancing reclamation science, specifically shrub establishment and cheatgrass mitigation. Chris Durham is an assistant field manager with resources in BLM's Buffalo field office. After 4 years in the Army, Chris spent 2 years at the University of Idaho and 2 years at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, where he earned a BS in wildlife biology. Chris began his BLM career in 1999 at the Rock Springs field office, where he started out fixing fence and working as a laborer at the Wild Horse facility. During his 8.5 years in Rock Springs, he was also a fire rehab implementation leader, wildlife biologist, and natural resource specialist in the Minerals and Lands Group, permitting oil and gas projects. Chris came to Buffalo in December of 2007 as a supervisory NRS, natural resource specialist, responsible for the range and wildlife programs. He has been the assistant field manager for resources in Buffalo since about 2011. Chris's team includes range specialists, wildlife biologists, GIS specialists, the recreation planner, archaeologists, hydrologists, hydrotechs, the administration group, soil scientist, 2 lead specialists, and a supervisory NRS. Trish Sweener is a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service office in Cheyenne. She has a bachelor's degree in wildlife biology from Colorado State University and a master's degree in wildlife ecology from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. She's worked for state game and fish agencies, the Canadian Park Service, the Swedish Wildlife Research Center, USGS, private industry, Sierra Club, wildlife consulting companies, and for the last 14 years, she has been with the Fish and Wildlife Service. In her younger days, she worked on a project involving ungulate and large carnivore management. Currently, her work is focused on migratory bird conservation during energy project development. Tim Beyer is a Wyoming native, born and raised in Casper. He holds a bachelor's degree in wildlife management from the University of Wyoming and currently works on the Douglas Ranger District and Thunder Basin National Grassland of the Medicine Bow Route National Forest as one of the 3 district wildlife biologists. He's responsible for a wide variety of wildlife resource areas, including raptor management, and also is charged with providing wildlife-specific management recommendations to a wide variety of proposed activities on national forest and national grassland surfaces, including mining, grazing, and oil and gas development. Tim has been a U.S. Forest Service representative on several international committees, including the team that developed the North American Conservation Action Plans for the ferruginous hawk, burrowing owl, and black-tailed prairie dog. Tim also represented the Forest Service as a member of the Wings Across America's Prairie Wings team to Mexico. He has been a member of the Wyoming Important Bird Area Technical Review Group, the Wyoming Partners in Flight Bird Conservation Planning Team, and several greater sage-grouse working groups. He's been with the Forest Service for over 30 years and has been a wildlife technician, a district biologist, and a wildlife program manager, and is also an acting deputy district ranger and acting forest biologist at different times in his career. Gary Bouvet was born and raised in what used to be Fort Collins, Colorado. Not sure what that means, but I guess those of you from Colorado do. He earned a bachelor's degree in biology from Colorado College and a PhD in zoology from the University of Wyoming. Gary served as the lead zoologist for Wyoming Natural Diversity Database for 2 years, then as director for the past 17 years. Currently, he also serves as the interim director for the Biodiversity Institute at the University of Wyoming. And that is all the time we have, so if you have any questions. Okay, there's that. So, sorry. I spend a lot of time working alone, so I'm not really used to having to interact with people very often. So one of the goals from the last time was talk about data standardization. And in order to accomplish that, you have to recognize a couple of things. One of them is, importantly, not every regulatory agency has the same data requirements. And that is an important point. It's much like saying a Raptor buffer should not be standardized across all species without taking other things into consideration. It's the same thing. You have different requirements from different agencies, and those requirements help direct how much flexibility an operator might have. So in order to get to standardization of data, we first have to ask really what kind of information is being collected and why is it being collected. So we just made this little summary table. I want to stress that this is not a official public document. It's just a summary to provide you with a visual aid that I think might help explain why coal operators, for example, can work 24/7 year-round, whereas other industries may not be able to do that in every area they wish to work. And one of the big reasons, if you look here, we've got the major groups here at our table, and a couple of important things. First of all, is it's important to recognize that the Fish and Wildlife Service makes recommendations, whereas DEQ, BLM, Forest Service, Game and Fish, they can actually apply requirements. So I'm going to let all of these folks talk about their different agencies, but what I really want you to see in this table is this column right here has something in every single row. This column does as well, but the difference is these are requirements and these are recommendations. But one of the reasons it's hard to standardize data is because this agency has a different requirement than this one, than this one, than this one, than this one. A lot of similarities, but once you get past that fourth row, you start seeing a pretty wide variety. So we thought it would be helpful for you all to understand why different organizations are collecting the data. What do they need the data for? To make decisions. What kind of decisions? Well, it varies. So I'm just going to let, I guess Tim will just start with you, and I'll hand you the mic. And oh, you have a mic. Excellent. Even better.
I don't know if this yet it works. Okay, so as a land management agency, and we discussed this a little bit at the last symposium as well, the data we collect is applied to all of our land management activities. So it's not just the mineral industry, it's recreation, it's livestock grazing, it's wildlife habitat improvements. The entire gambit of what we manage has to have the same stipulations applied to them. There are variations depending on what's going on, but the reason we collect the data is so that we can give input to our decision makers on how we need to implement a project. There are some projects out there that if you're going to be grading a road and you're going past a nest and it's just going down the road, really has no effect on it. If you're going to be stuck on a location for several weeks to several months, that can have a different effect on the raptors that we deal with. And so we end up having to gather the data, specifically the top 3 that we were looking at there, so that we have that information to inform the decision makers that are out there. One of the things that the Forest Service has to deal with is that we have to maintain a well-distributed population. That's under the, under the NFMA, or the National Forest Management Act. So we have some other obligations that are given to us in how we manage wildlife populations as well. And so to do that, we have to keep all the habitats essentially intact in one form or another. And in doing that, also be flexible enough to allow for other land management activities. So when we gather our data, we don't necessarily gather it across the grasslands 100% every year. I'd love to, but the money just isn't there. So ideally, if I can get it done once every 3 to 5 years across any given piece of ground, I'm doing pretty well. So the discussion the governor had just a little bit ago of having buffers that are out there and having to deal with programmatic type buffers, that's because we have, our data is gathered at such a light level that I don't have the privilege of being able to go in and look at a project specific during the out year. If somebody wants to come in and do a project in January, I may not have data that's current. And so trying to be able to be responsive to those companies and other activities at a time when they want to ask the question, instead of telling them they have to wait until we do all of our surveys. There are some projects we still wait on because they're going to be long-term activities or long-term decisions. But the why for gathering the data is so that we can inform the decisions. We do have the standard buffers in our land management plan. I worked under a plan before this one where it was more incumbent upon the biologist to decide whether the activity would cause nesting failure. That becomes a very difficult situation, particularly if you're the biologist, because you have everybody looking to do their work when they would like to, and as you're the biologist and trying to inform everyone and keep it at a level that is fair for everyone becomes very difficult. It's much easier for the companies, the other resources that are involved, to have some sort of a programmatic system in place so that they understand the rules coming in, and just because I decide that I really don't want to see the rainbow family recreation activity happening on the national grasslands doesn't give me the authority to use wildlife as a reason to stop illegal activity. So we needed to standardize those things, and that's why in our land management plan we do have those buffers in place. And I look at that land management plan as the contract we have with the citizens of the United States. So as much as we've got the laws that we saw earlier about, we also have our land management plans that once passed tend to be the rules we have to play with. And I think with that I'll pass it on.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to participate today. I'm gonna back up to a couple things that have been said, and before we get into the why, and because some of the answers and some of the history here will answer the why the coal programs and mining programs in the state collect the level of data they do. I've been fortunate enough to have worked with, in particular, Goldens for a long time in my career. In fact, was instrumental in some of the initial high wall moves, nest designs for artificial nests to get them to readily take. When I was at Glen Rock, there were pairs there that had nested for over 25 years successfully that had been moved out of high walls. So I have a pretty good background in this, and what I can tell you is the data that land quality and DEQ has come to is for a couple of reasons. First is we know that pretty soundly with the science that a continuous activity around these birds and their nesting structures really doesn't bother them that much. They're pretty tolerant of that, provided there's a good prey base. The intermittent disturbances, where you have large acreage permits and you have mines operating in multiple pits where you're intermittent, those tend to have more impact on the birds and their nesting. And you know, I can say that after looking at them and working with them and with some of the best people in the industry for 25 years. That's just what we know. So I'm not going to say there's a pro or a con to buffers. I'm just going to say those are some facts in the science that are pretty well documented. The second thing is the regulations, in particular for coal, with the relationship with the Surface Mine Control Reclamation Act and the nexus to the federal regs, is a moving target constantly. And I'm going to pick on Trish a little bit, so I'm close so she can hit me. But in Wyoming, in my career, I have gone through, as far as U.S. Fish and Wildlife coordinators, 7 of them in the Cheyenne office. And a lot of times they come in from a different part of the country, and it takes a while to get them up to speed with the fundamental ecology of arid land ecology out here. So how this works and the time that takes and that investment, the more data we have and the better the data set is, the easier it is to work through that education with different people and moving targets. And in coal in particular, they don't want to be held up. What goes on the track and goes out the gate is critically important to those companies and on a day-to-day basis. So they want to have the data in place such that the flexibility is there to address those different regulations and come up with those mitigation strategies. So the extent that the data is collected is for a couple of reasons, and that's why. That gets to the why. Now, as a policy guy now, which Dave kind of hung around my neck, you know, I have to say, it's a lot easier to make the policy call when you have the data set. And there's certain, like I say, there's certain things we know, but if you have the data that says you have a nesting pair that's been there for 15 years, you've had a haul road by it for 15 years, they've produced, they've had brood for 15 years, you know that consistent and activity by that nest really isn't going to have a big impact on them. You have the data set to make that policy call. So with that, I'll pass it on.
Thank you for letting me be here. And basically, I'm going to go back to what former Governor Dave Friedenthal said. And really, this is about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the Eagle Act. And what we are trying to do as the Fish and Wildlife Service is assist individuals and companies with compliance under those laws. And there's multiple ways that that can be achieved. And I think we often are talking about these nest buffers, and that has been a default. And it is based on science about those individual species, but it has little to do sometimes with what is happening in a local situation. So if you come to us and you say, we have no other information than that we have this species of bird nesting here, we will provide the recommendation to you that if you adhere to this spatial and temporal buffer around this nest, it is unlikely that take will result. And that is one approach. And I think sometimes what has been lost is that there's flexibility, there's multiple approaches in how you might achieve certainty that there will be no likelihood of take at a nest. And one of those approaches is through development of plans, such as what the coal mines have. And in those plans, we can begin to understand situations where, especially pairs of birds, have developed acceptance of certain types of disturbance. And that is data specific to that local area. And that is the type of information that we would ask be provided in order for us to understand that there need not be an adherence to these standard nest buffers, that there is flexibility in those buffers. And I think that is understood, but we can't, again, understand that unless we have the data that will inform it. And the types of data that we ask for as regards conservation of these species is based on the type of threat present. And different industries have different types of threats. And that is just as important as gathering data about the bird species, what's present out there, is what is the threat of take to these birds. If there's no threat of take, you don't need to collect that data. As per the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the Eagle Act. There may be other reasons you would collect that data for research based on other objectives, But if it's just for protection of those species under these two acts, then it's really it's threat-based. There are, and we work with other agencies, land management agencies, and they have their own responsibilities. There's Executive Order 13186, and their resource management plans that they have to adhere to, and those might be above and beyond some of the information that we're asking for. So it's important to remember that when we say we don't have regulations as regarding what type of information you need to collect, and those approaches are voluntary. What isn't voluntary is compliance under the law, and that's what we're trying to help you achieve.
Thanks, and thanks to the organizers for putting this on and for giving me a chance to be part of this. I'm a wildlife biologist out of the University of Wyoming, so I'm here to represent sort of the researcher's perspective on why we collect data, which in some ways is a pretty easy answer. As everyone else has done, I'll reflect a little bit on Governor Dave's comments. First of all, he equated scientists with lawyers, and I'm not sure who should be more insulted by that. I think it's you guys, Ryan, should be more insulted by that comparison. But he also drew this kind of this dichotomy in science, or he grouped scientists into two groups: the pure scientists and the applied scientists, or those that do decision-relevant work, which is a great phrase, which I plan on plagiarizing shamelessly. Decision-relevant science. I'm an applied scientist. I like to do science that answers questions of meaning to managers and policymakers. I think that's what motivates me. That's what motivates a lot of people to do science, to answer meaningful questions. But there are also scientists that do a lot of basic, pure science, theoretical science, and they would say, why do I collect data? Well, I collect data so that it sort of advances general human understanding of how the world works, and that's legitimate, and that is one reason why scientists collect data. But another one is to answer meaningful questions and inform decisions that affect energy production, conservation, ecosystem services, and land management, and so on and so forth. And so it's, I think I have the easy job up here. We often say that the scientist has the easy job. We just go out and we make the measurements, and then the managers and the policymakers have the hard job. They have to figure out what to do with those measurements. But after we've made our measurement, we step back and say, there you go. Now have at it, and it is a lot easier. And so I don't know that I have a whole lot more to contribute other than that.
I'd also, from the BLM, like to echo my thanks for the Campbell County Commissioners and the other organizers of this, and for inviting us to be up here today. I guess I'm also going to echo that in my experience in the BLM, most of our day-to-day activities are related to decisions we make. There are decisions that are currently being implemented, like our land use plans, and decisions that we're analyzing are pending decisions. And therefore, the why, the answer to the why we collect certain data can start, from sort of a landscape level where we collect data, take a look at the effectiveness toward reaching our plan objectives and our land use plans, and to see how those conservation measures, which have been informed by process, sometimes a very long process, and informed, also incorporating the Fish and Wildlife Service recommendations, and we can see how effective we are toward reaching those objectives through collecting specific data. The effectiveness then at a sort of more local level of our conditions of approval or our operator committed measures at individual things that we take a look at, for example, oil and gas decisions. And we can see how effective those particular localized conservation measures are in achieving the objectives that we've set. We can also take both of these and take a look at the applicability of our successes and lessons learned in order to apply them to future proposals, and in order to take a look and adapt some of our past strategies toward conservation. And we can also take a look at triggers to adapt during the life of a particular project. The data we collect can inform us whether or not something's working or working much better than we thought it would, and then would allow us midstream, sometimes during the life of a project or for subsequent projects, to better adapt our strategies in the future. Subsequent to the discussions in 2015, I know a number of folks got together and developed that standardized data form. And in the BLM office in Buffalo, our GIS specialists, wildlife staff, and Tom from the planning staff got together and distilled that list into those items that we felt essentially met the data collection objectives, which would serve those kind of questions that we identified above. And we've started to distribute those that subset of data from that overall sheet for comment and for use, as well as protocols for surveys and so forth that would go toward answering those questions. And I think that from our perspective, that's kind of why we collect the data we collect, to inform those particular decisions, but also inform how well those decisions are going over as we look at the projects and proposals that we approve during the life of those projects.
Thanks. I also appreciate being invited back to this second symposium. Before I begin, I'd just like a show of hands. Who attended the 2015 symposium? Great, so quite a few. Okay. So, I'm going to use these for reading. From the Wyoming Game and Fish Department perspective on monitoring, the Game and Fish is required by state statute to manage all species of wildlife within our borders. So I'd like to do two things. One, just give a brief monitoring overview, why we monitor in the first place, and then narrow that down to why we monitor raptors. Monitoring is an essential component of wildlife management and conservation science. Effective monitoring programs can identify species that are at risk due to small or declining populations, provide an understanding of how management, organizational, and administrative actions affect populations, provide key information on the distribution of species and the status of their populations, and evaluate population responses to climate change and alterations on the landscape. Monitoring information is needed by natural resources management agencies to make informed, science-based management decisions on a daily basis and to effectively implement long-term wildlife and land use plans. Specifically for raptors, they're also called birds of prey. They're keystone predators, which means that they are species without which ecosystems would degrade and fail over time. In Wyoming, raptors include hawks, eagles, falcons, harriers, osprey, vultures, and owls. Like other birds, raptors are protected under state and federal legislation. So it's important to inventory and monitor their populations to identify threats, understand population dynamics and causes of population declines or increases, and to adequately inform management and legislative decisions. Raptors and other birds of prey are important indicators of biodiversity and can be used to indicate the state of an ecosystem. Monitoring raptor populations can help us understand ecosystem processes and overall environmental health. Raptors are large and readily observed, thus they're a group of species that lend themselves particularly well to monitoring. Accurate knowledge of population status and change is fundamental to conservation of all wildlife species. Through monitoring, we're able to determine various factors such as presence, distribution, species richness, density, occupancy, or population trend over time, depending on project objectives. Raptor monitoring allows us to collect data sets, both short-term and long-term, that can help us understand the cause of any changes in population when used alongside environmental and other applicable data sets. This helps to identify which species may be in need of conservation action, which supports the legal obligations of the Game and Fish Department, again, to manage all native and intentionally introduced species of wildlife within our borders. National and international laws to protect wildlife and habitats require assessments of the conservation status of birds of prey, along with other wildlife and plant species. As top predators, raptors are often the first species to be affected by a range of environmental pressures, such as habitat availability and quality, habitat loss or degradation, prey populations, pollutants, and human disturbance. Thus, Raptor monitoring can also provide insight into environmental conditions on the landscape. Raptors can provide a cost-effective and sensitive means of detecting environmental change. This was very successfully confirmed through pioneering research on the response of birds of prey to chlorines in the environment and the subsequent recovery of declining populations such as the peregrine falcon and bald eagle. Some raptor species have specific breeding and nesting needs that can indicate something about the functioning of the larger ecosystem. So to summarize, successful raptor conservation and management require a broad-scale understanding of population sizes and trends, coupled with more detailed knowledge of the biology of raptor species and individuals within each species. This includes details on where they nest, the status of their reproduction and productivity, what and where they hunt, and their sensitivity to changes and disturbances on the landscape.
Thank you, everyone. So some common themes, obviously a lot of decision-making goals for collecting the data, but some differences as well. And as I said before, what you want to do with the data long-term also impacts what kind of information you're collecting. You want to do some mitigation planning, then you have to have the adequate database to make informed decisions so you have the best chance for success. You want to have flexibility in your operations. Again, in my experience, the best way to achieve that is by having the information that helps the decision makers recognize that you have a good understanding of what is happening in the landscape in general, and also for that specific pair that's going to be impacted. And that helps them have the information they need to make the decision that is beneficial to your goals, but also beneficial to maintaining the pairs. We have quite a few minutes left, I believe. Does anybody have some questions? Other than how do we get rid of raptor buffers? But
It was interesting to see the different perspectives up there. I probably include me in the applied part of what I do. So, but I understand the need for information, but it has a quantity component and a timing component. So in general, and anybody can answer this, when do you know that enough is enough based on a decision that you need to make? Pretty broad question, but I'd be curious to hear people's responses.
Okay, Brenda, can you hear me now? Thanks for that question. When I look at a data set, from a policy standpoint or a decision standpoint on a permit, when I have to look at that, I look at what we have, what's required by the rules and regs, and then, base my decision on that. And fortunately, for the mining side of things, in the rules and regs, it's pretty well laid out, and the guidance has been pretty well hammered out over the last 35 years. So when there is a discrepancy, though, I do go back to my 25 years of experience and weigh that in that decision. I mean, that you have to. And that's where the common sense and applied science portion of it fits in for me.
I guess one of the things from a land management standpoint, from my perspective, our data collection is ongoing because it depends on the question you're asking. If it's project related, then we need the information generally at least a year in advance so that we have some information to make the decisions following a NEPA process. That's usually enough to make our decisions. If you're looking at land management activities, then it's an ongoing process, because I have to look at population trends, much like what Andrea was talking about, to see what our overall activity for implementing our land management plan is doing. So I have obligations both at the project level and at the landscape level. And so depending on what kind of a project you're doing, it may be as simple as, for oil and gas, having 1 or 2 years worth of survey information allows us to make the decision, and then overall monitoring so that we can see if other effects are happening as a part of the implementation. But if you're looking at it from a land management standpoint, it's a never-ending process, because we have things that continue to go on so long as we're managing the lands.
Similar to what Tim said. Well, first of all, could you, when you ask questions, could you give your name and who you're with?
Brenda Schladweiler. I'm with BKS Environmental. I'm not a wildlife biologist, but I do soils and vegetation, and we collect data.
Okay, thank you. So for our perspective, when we're looking at, a particular species, it depends on the question. Again, do we want to know what the diversity is, like what's out there initially? Then that might only take a season or so. If we want to know population trend, it's obviously going to take many years of doing standardized surveys to get that information. So you really base your monitoring program on what your initial question is and the sort of like the outcome that you want from that question. What information do you need for that particular question or program or project? So it's not just a standard answer. It really depends on the individual question.
This is probably another way of saying the same thing that other people have been saying, but it frames it a little differently, and it's actually a perspective that Zach Wallace from the Wyoming Natural Diversity Database has brought up, is that it seems like there's this question of how much science is enough. Really, enough relates to what phase a project is in, and that there's a lot of existing science that is enough in early project phases, I think. I mean, to answer the question, if you're planning an oil and gas development somewhere in the Powder River Basin, do you have to worry about raptors and which species? Well, we know that. We know, yes, you do, and we know which species are here. We know which species breed here. We know what kinds of habitats they use to breed. So at those early planning phases, there's a lot of science. But as the project progresses to actual, on-ground action, the science needed has to become more and more site-specific. The question, comes up, pretty soon, is this particular nest going to be affected by this particular activity? That data may not be out there. That may need to be collected on site, and that has to be some novel science that's generated there. So it seems like there's this question of scale that correlates with the stage at which a project is in. Planning and siting, general siting kinds of questions. I think there is a lot of good science existing to inform that. But beyond that, it has to get pretty site specific. Extrapolation of results from other areas may work in early project phases. It may not work for later project phases.
To expand on that just a little bit, as you reach that point where you're looking at site-specific issues, I think it occurs to me that that's where people come into play, where the policy and the science come together to determine how much data collection is enough in that particular situation, and the technological requirements of the project being proposed, combined with what the biologist or other scientists indicate needs to be collected, have to come to a decision point, and that's where, in our agency, the policymakers determine that we have enough data to render a decision.
So one of the questions I had, Jim Willings, Commissioner, Commerce County, it goes back to Trish, and maybe it kind of got addressed here. It's a follow-up, but if I understood you right, you talked to some that if there's not a threat, there's no need to do research. I may be paraphrasing slightly how you said it, but it seems like we spend a lot of time and money doing research to decide if there's going to be a take. So it seems like a circular process that we can never get out. If we're studying, decide if there's going to be a take. If there's a take, we study if there's been one. And I maybe misunderstood how you said it, but I guess how do we get out of that circular reference? And it goes back a little bit, when's enough, so it maybe ties back into that, if you would.
Sure, and actually I don't work in what I would call research at the moment. What I am concerned about is project threats, and so to migratory birds and how we conserve our migratory bird species. And what we need for those types of actions is monitoring. If you want to call it research, you can, but to me it's monitoring. And that is what you need to do for your specific projects. If you want to do something at a larger scale, and that is what I kind of have seen be the impetus for this symposium is let's try and do something at a larger scale and then apply it to a smaller scale. And in order to do that, you need way above and beyond the work that I do. And that would be, a really tight, well-developed data collection methodology, potentially modeling, and then the application of that. These are things that are very involved, expensive, take a lot of time, very worthwhile efforts, but I don't work at that level. I work at a small project scale level with developers and companies, and at that level we're looking at monitoring, and we want to find out what's happening in this local geographic area and how can I help you understand how you can avoid take and conserve these species. And I can help you different ways. One of the ways I can help you is to say, hey, we have these default nest buffers. These are things that through our ability to understand the science that's been done, the research that's been done, support a determination, a decision, that if you stay out of these buffers during this period of time and out of this distance from the nest, it's unlikely you will have a take of that active nest. And so that is one of the applications of research. It's sort of like there's been research out there and we can use that and bring it back to this smaller scale. But there's not a lot of research out there that we can take from this larger scale to the smaller scale. And the easiest way to approach it at this point in time is to get the monitoring at this small scale. And with that monitoring, you can begin to understand a little bit more about what's happening in your project area, where you have active nests, where you have territories, where you have threats, where you might be able to work such that you don't have to always adhere to those buffers, but still avoid take and conserve those species. And we're more than willing to work with you doing that. And there have been, the Buffalo BLM office has kind of spearheaded some of those efforts with oil and gas companies, and I think they can be quite successful. It maybe doesn't work everywhere, but it's an approach, and I think that's my message here is that there are different approaches that you can take in order to comply with these laws. There's a lot of flexibility. It just takes us being smart and really understanding what's out there in your project area or in your area where you are going to potentially impact those species. So again, it's not grandiose and it's not research. but really, you know, that's the work I do, and that's the help I can offer. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you, Trish. Thanks, everyone. I apologize, we're out of time. But the good news is, we're all still here. So thank you all for the panelists, and again, thanks to the commissioners for inviting us back again this year. And we will turn it off over to the next speakers. Thank you.
And